Well, welcome everyone. My name is Michael D. Giovine. I'm professor of anthropology at Westchester University and also the series editor of Lexington Books series, The Anthropology of Tourism, Heritage, Mobility, and Society. And I want to welcome you to our next installment of our author conversation series, where I talk with authors of recently published books in the series. And I'm really, really pleased today to chat with Frances Julia Riemer, who is a professor. She's an anthropologist, but also professor of educational foundations at an associate faculty and director of the Women and Gender Studies program at Northern Arizona University. She also comes with a lot of consulting work and NGO work with Save the Children and other organizations in tourism development, especially in Botswana, and has really done great ethnographies on women basket weavers and women small scale tourism workers in Botswana. So it's really great to to get this beautiful book in my hands, Recentering Women in Tourism, Anti-Colonial Feminist Studies. So thank you, Frances, for coming here and speaking with us today on this book.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. Thank you, everybody, for joining. And thank you, Michael, for all the help and support that you have given in shepherding this through.
Well, thank you. We've been talking about this for a while because there's no better person to write, a volume. This is also different. I should mention, too, that a lot of our books in our series, and you can see them. Ooh, they're so pretty back here. But a lot of the books in the series are ethnographies, right? They're monographs. And there are a couple in the series as well that are edited volumes. You have a great one on wellness and tourism, for example. I published one with John Bodinger on study abroad as a volume. They're different, right? They bring in different voices than just your own. And, being an editor, it's no easier or harder than writing a book, right? You have to be able to kind of have a vision and craft that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And yeah, absolutely. And this book started with I'll
sure.
Start. Yeah, this book started with not with a vision, but also a real problem, right? That it really stemmed from my own work in Botswana with women basket weavers and not being able to understand and then not really being able to write about what had happened with the weavers.
Right.
And it wasn't until, well, let me just step back. For those of you who didn't read that chapter, I had gone to Botswana originally to look at adult literacy and the role that adult literacy plays in the ways people engage with the marketplace, right? Engage with selling things, engage with jobs. And so I was able to go and talk to these women who live in the Okavango Delta and were weaving baskets. And it was a great project. Baskets, 1,300 women were weaving baskets. They were beautiful. Of course, these were Dutch Reformed a missionary couple that really got the basket weaving project going with refugees. At one point, the closet in which they stored all the baskets that they had bought was like something out of The Wizard of Oz. When they opened up the door to the stock, it was as though the baskets were glowing. I mean, the basket industry was just incredible. Every year there would be a exhibit at the museum in the capital, Gaborone, where some of the weavers would come see the city for the first time in their lives. And the audience was mostly expats, right? Aid workers, State Department folks. People were just, the buyers, the expats were just mesmerized by these baskets. Botswana put them on their stamps. It was part of their tourism industry, sort of safaris and these baskets. And then over time, the missionaries left. The local folks could not maintain the market connections and the weaving project died. And as I say in the chapter, the last time I was there, the compound was overgrown, grass this high, cows wandering about in the middle of the marketplace, in the middle of the compound. the magical basket storage closet had just really been left. And there were maybe like 15 baskets all covered with dust, and everything had just been abandoned. And I couldn't understand why. I couldn't understand how this happened. And it took me quite a, you know how we are as anthropologists, right? We look at something, we see it, and then we have to figure out how to talk about it. And I walked around not knowing how to think about this until I sort of meandered upon this notion of anti-colonial feminist theory, right? And so feminist theory requires us to center women, and particularly to center women who have been the most marginalized. And the notion is that once we center those women, we get a much fuller, much richer understanding of what's going on, right? In a more multidimensional way of understanding. So that was helpful for me in thinking about my own project. And then adding on the layer of thinking about tourism as a colonial practice, as a neo-colonial practice, right? And how did that map over the story of these women weavers who, once I sort of thought about this, it all made complete sense, right? Here we have these white Dutch missionaries who come in to save these women. I mean, they needed saving. They were refugees, right? But came in, saved these women, helped them reinvigorate their traditional skills, connected them to the marketplace. But of course, totally an external market, which is typical of tourism, right? Totally an external market. When the ties to the external market get frayed, the project falls apart. The project is not sustainable. And so once that all started to fit together for me in my head, I became curious about tourism in general. And I was interested in what happens when we think about tourism through this lens, what gets unearthed. And so I sent out a call for proposals, asking folks. I had two main questions that I asked folks in the proposal. I asked them, what would it mean if we looked at tourism through an anti-colonial lens? And how would we make sense of the ways that tourism unfolds? What does tourism look like when we center the lived experiences of women? And what happens when we employ a feminist anti-colonial lens to the anthropology of tourism? And I got this great selection of chapters based on ethnographic research.
That's great. And you know, I like also that it's pretty well organized in that you have, you know, the first section is really about centering women travelers, right? Like let's focus on the woman and the whole thing is about, to me, it's all about contradictions, to be perfectly honest. This book, there's a lot of these contradictions that I love to tear, to piece out a little bit. But you know, you have the contradictions with when you center women and decolonize the woman traveler. And then of course the next one are, you know, work that you've done as well, like that. Let's now look at hosts, you know, the tourism hosts, not just the guests. And then of course this third section, which I also really appreciate, which is, it ends on kind of a positive note about like some positive, more sustainable tourism initiatives, where you're centering women and empowering women in those small scale tourism.
Yes. And just to note that Karen Stalker.
Yeah, I saw. Yeah, she's in. So we wanted Karen, when we do that third section, I want to pull you up if that's okay, and we can chat. And I believe Lynn hopefully will be popping on too. She just wrote.
Great, and I just resent her the link.
Great. So yeah. Well, all right. So to me, let's talk about even the first section a little bit. There's a lot of contradictions inherent when you start to really center and focus on gender or on women in tourism.
Yes.
You know, one of the things, and it's pointed out here as well, but you know, we all talk about it, is that you talk about it in the introduction too, is that, you know, the World Tourism Organization, the UNWTO, likes to tout the fact that there's nearly 60% of the employees in the global tourism sector are women, which is far, you know, which is very unusual for other sectors, right? But at the same time, I mean, you're still getting the people in power are often the men anyway. It's kind of like the same, when you're looking at a cook versus a chef. I'm sure 60-70% of women are the cooks and the feeders, but yet the smaller percentage or the celebrity chefs they're mostly all men. And so you get that contradiction. You get, this great, I love this, the 23%, like 3% is much different, but 23% of all tourism ministers are women, which, doesn't seem like a lot, but when you think about it,
Sure.
other ministers around, like other people in cabinet positions are men. Usually, women only account for 20. But again, tourism minister, how much power they have? They're not the Secretary of State, right? They're not, Secretary of Interior or something. So you do get these contradictions. Did you see, I mean, was this something that you also saw a trend or a theme throughout the book?
Yes, and I think these are really good examples of the way that this notion of theory helps us sort of reframe, right? So, right, I mean, and we had talked about this even when I first pitched the book, right? You had said, well, tourism looks like a good industry for women.
Right.
And in fact, statistics say it does. It is. But the reality is, and this is true across the board institutionally, whenever we look at things like gender, but of course, ethnicity, race, I mean, any kind of cultural variable, that the broader social organization gets, of course, reproduced in that sector. And so we see the same thing happening in tourism, that we do see this increase of women. And of course, part of that is because we see more women in the marketplace in general, right? More women are working, more women are part of then the pool that we see represented in tourism and in other sectors. But of course, we also see, again, as I write here, I copied something from the book. Tourism's cash infusion has been found to reproduce rather than disrupt gender, racial, and other cultural roles and hierarchies, right? The tension of increased opportunities and reproduction of gender roles and salary disparities has been both constant and disconcerting in the research. So, and we know that, right? I mean, this is why this is such a fascinating topic, that when we think about these things in this reframed way, we know, right? I just had this, I live in Sedona, Arizona, which is, you can see it in the background. It's surrounded by red rock buttes. It's part of the geologic rift. It's a tourist town, 9,000 some people, 3 million visitors a year. So super saturated with tourism. We're having a really big conflict around the local ownership versus, chains. I just got onto the tourism commission, and one of the city council members asked me why is locally centered tourism? Why should we think about locally centered tourism? What's wrong with having a big hotel chain come in? That gives us lots of jobs. But of course, we know those jobs are service jobs, right? They're hard jobs that don't pay enough and don't offer wages. And they're mostly the service pieces of them are often gendered. And so we see the same thing, right, in this book, that the ways we think about gender gets reproduced.
Yeah,
absolutely. And if we just think about gender through this like neoliberal economic lens, we see this positive, we can spin it in a very positive way.
right. Well, I mean, numbers, right? The numbers don't lie. It's another thing, we're anthropologists, so we like that
Right.
qualitative data.
Yeah.
We know you could feel the lived experiences are qualitatively
Exactly.
different.
Right.
But yet you get these percentages that look nice, right? And so that often obscures the actual context and the deep lived experiences.
Absolutely.
But I think that's what's so fascinating about tourism. And you even mentioned, or somebody in the book mentions it, but I think you do, where, a lot of the issues and the problems and the contradictions that come up in this book about surrounding gender roles and gender performances and things are not unique to tourism. But what's interesting or nice about tourism, why we both do it, I'm sure, is because it's a microcosm. It's like a total social fact. I've actually used that old school, term by Marcel Mauss and Malinowski. This idea that it really combines everything. It's a good microcosm to understand the world in general and how it works.
Yeah. And, pragmatically, I mean, I always say that and on my website, I call myself a traveler extraordinaire. I love the notion of travel. My grandmother took me to Austria as a child. I became a traveler as an early age. It made me an anthropologist. It
Yep.
made me love the notion of culture, and culture in other places. And I think that traveling is one of the rare opportunities that we have, aspirationally anyway, to meet people who are people but are different than us, right? Food
Yeah.
is different. The ways we work are different. The ways we live are different. And I love that. I love the aspiration of that we can engage with culture. Of course, what we learn is that we're often not engaging, right? We anthropologists of tourism know very well about the tourist bubble, right?
Right.
And that comes up in all kinds of studies in tourism, as well as in the chapters here in this book.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that voluntourism chapter is really talks about the voluntourist
Right.
bubble as well. And I wanted to talk about that one. But first, just to push, isn't traveling and the ability to travel, though, wouldn't you consider that to be some sort of neo-colonial, not only in the effects that we have, but it's a classist thing? I mean, there's a lot of my students like yours were state
Yeah.
schools, right? And there are people who say, I just can't afford to travel. And even with scholarships and things like that, they're still not making money. They still have to work,
Right.
and we're foregoing that. So it's
Yeah,
just a very difficult thing. You want people to travel. I want people to travel. I was the
exactly.
same boat as you. I traveled as a kid, did study abroad as a kid.
Right.
My mom
Exactly.
ran a program, and um,
Yeah.
not everybody can do it. It's
Yeah. Yeah.
tough.
Yeah, and that's one of the things. I mean, I'm at Northern Arizona University, large first generation college.
Yeah.
I was first gen college student, but large first gen college student population. And that is one of the challenges that we're having in terms of study abroad. Both how do we help students have those opportunities financially, but also how do we help students have those challenges, have those opportunities sort of aspirationally,
Right.
because it's both the finances, but it's also the idea of travel
Yeah.
is class-based, right? Because if you don't do it, it's something that you don't think is possible.
Right. It's not for me.
Right, exactly. And parents get,
Yeah.
if your parent has not had our experiences, then the parent is more concerned and more frightened. It's a chaotic world out there. We all know that, right? And so how do we think about that? And how do we help people think about that? But then even once we organize, how do we create experiences that don't reproduce these tourist bubbles, right? That really get people out and enjoying the opportunity.
Yeah, and it's harder, it's easier said than done. It's not an easy thing to try to get people out of, and there's all kinds of ethical issues surrounding that. I like the and I think some of these cases at the end, really kind of talk about that. Let's have some of these more authentic and empowering
Right.
experiences where both sides are kind of empowered, and that's what you need to do. It's just, again, it's almost like a neo-colonial kind of a thing, because we're still the ones that are coming in and saying, hey, do it this way and then you'll be empowered.
Yeah.
Empowerment, giving power to somebody, is not the same thing as people structurally having that power to begin with, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to add, and then just that when I was talking about traveling in a graduate class last semester, and I had students I had a student from Russia who who reminded me that traveling is not only a privilege, a class privilege, but traveling is also a sort of global privilege, that for people from some countries, travel is quite limited. So from some countries, you can't even come into the US to transfer to get to someplace else,
Right.
right? And so there are all kinds of structural ways that travel is indeed, and has always been, this sort of colonial proposition.
Oh yeah, I mean, since the advent of passports, I mean, it's been,
Right,
which is not a very old. I mean, you have Santiago de Compostela, that had like the original kind of passport, but that was different, But really, in like the late 1800s or something was when
right,
passports really started,
right. Yeah,
happening, and then that started to constrain more than to allow. We
yeah,
often think of like, oh, I have a passport, I'm allowed. This is giving
right,
me an ability, but actually, passports, the whole point was to constrain
exactly.
travel. You
Yes,
can't just
and
travel
organized.
anywhere. Yeah. You know, when you're talking about the almost like the psychological willingness to travel, especially for younger travelers, you know, you juxtapose two chapters really well, one on volunteerism and one on backpacking, you know.
Right.
And it's very interesting. We were talking about this before. You know, I find it interesting because just like study abroad, you know, there is voluntourism, it has that bubble, right? The author
Right.
talks about this voluntourist bubble, and consequently you do see that almost 70% of voluntourists are female, are women. And you know, that's an extraordinary number. And you know, I have my own ideas which I will bring up, but what do you think the reasons for that, you know, big skew in terms of why some people want to do voluntourism travel or volunteer
Yeah.
travel?
I mean, that's a really good question. I'm working on another project that has to do with women serving universities, right? That across the globe now there are more women attending universities than men. And
Yeah.
again, we link that back to sort of the success of the feminist movement, that women have now the ability to go to college. So it's not that more women are going to college. It's not that fewer men are going to college. The rates of men have remained the same, but now more women are going. So the rates of women have increased. And I imagine that we see that also reflected in study abroad, right? So I think that might be part of it. That's just a general trend. I don't know. I mean, I also speak on gender and climate change, and there are more women across the globe who are both affected by climate change, but also are active in addressing climate change. And so we have something going on with gender, I think, across the board, right? In that women are stepping up in ways that we didn't see before because women didn't have opportunities to do that.
No, yeah, I mean, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if it's fair to kind of ask if it has to do with kind of global stereotypes of like women and being the ones that are like the hosts, the hospitality, the caring, nurturing kind of people. Because across, I mean, we have several books even in the series, like Fang's book on women work in among the Meow people. You know, again, the men don't see number one, working in tourism in general as a male job, even in China, but also around the world in different countries. But maybe the travelers kind of self-select too, like, oh, if I'm going to travel, I'm going to do something that is like I'm more inclined to legitimize this travel because of the care that, you know, that it's given.
Right. And I would imagine that, and I don't know about this. I'm just thinking that if you looked at adventure tourism and volunteer tourism and looked at the gender dynamics, that might be very different, right? I hiked Machu Picchu a couple years ago, and certainly in our little group, there were slightly more men than women. So that might parse out differently, as you suggest, right? With gender and climate change, I talk about the fact that men have often been involved in fossil fuel industries, mining, right? And so that they're sort of manly things. And so that might be the case with tourism as well, right? That men do the manly kind of tourists.
Right. And yeah, exactly. Like backpacking is, you know, you're this free FITs, we called them, right? The free and independent traveler, where you know, you can just be the explorer, the Indiana Jones kind of person. I mean, certainly that's why I became an anthropologist. And although I never really liked backpacking, I did do it. And certainly there were women, but there were more men, you know.
It's more dangerous for women.
Well, and then that's kind of where I'm leading to, because I know that there's also among parents a lot more women study abroad than the guys. Some of it is because I hear the guys are always like, well, I have to work or I have to do an internship, something that seems a little more, you know, solid. But from administrators, they often say, well, because, you know, study abroad is like a bubble. It's kind of like you're going with a group, and so the parents feel more safe for their daughters to be in this group, whereas the guys are like, when you graduate, we'll just give you a plane ticket, you just go backpack around, you know.
I think so. You know, and that's why I and you had mentioned this earlier, you had talked about the first 3 chapters of the book, and I have to say that I was really taken by all 3 of those chapters.
They're great.
The first by Stevens on women traveling alone really was like a kick in the head for me, because I often travel alone, and I felt that I feel this through the book, that I identified so much and had to just totally reshift the way that I thought about things. Because when I first read the draft on women traveling alone, I thought, what do you mean women should not be traveling alone? We're just finally able to do this, right? And then, of course, as I read, I just became more and more captivated by the argument of what does it mean to be like the bigger argument, right? Of what does it mean to travel, and what are the roles and as anthropologists, what are the roles and responsibilities on everybody's part, and are we to do those? Does travel allow us to blend those in ways that maybe aren't always consonant? Yeah. And then, of course, the second there's also the piece on women backpackers, which I I backpacked through Europe when I graduated from college, and I feel like, well, I mean, I'm not going to say that I put myself in the skank category, but I certainly feel like I know that. That's very familiar to me. And then thinking about that anthropologically really allowed me to think about this notion of travel, as I mentioned this before, this liminal space, right? To pull on Victor Turner, and that travel can allow us to act out in ways that we may not typically. And I mean, we see that all the time in now that places have like party. I don't know if that's an official word, like party tourism, right? But I think
I mean, why not?
Right, so many places where people just or Las Vegas, where you're right. What happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas. What you do when you travel, like the women backpackers, is part of another self that is possible in some places, but not in your real life. I found that just absolutely
I mean, there was such resonance. You know, David Picard and I published a book a long time ago, Tourism and the Power of Otherness, and one of the things that we talk about a lot is that, you know, when you travel for tourism, you often want to engage in otherness. And again, especially as a man or a white man traveling to a developing country to see brown women, that's otherness in of itself. But then, what you're getting in that chapter on the skanky stories is what it's called, is this idea that, this is an opportunity to pursue what we call the other in ourselves, right? There's an other in us that we can let out in certain occasions, especially when you're not among your social circles, right? That's a lot of sex tourism, or the sexual, I didn't want to say sex tourism, but like the sexualized tourism, often that's what happens too. I mean, there's a lot of travel where people engage in homosexuality that they wouldn't at home. Right. Because it's like, oh, this is my opportunity to do something, that I wouldn't do at home. It's a facet of myself.
Absolutely. And we know that, or I have come to learn that, I mean, I knew about the typical sex tourism, right? White guy goes to Thailand, or wherever, but I had not really put into words the sex tourism that women women engage. So not only the skanks here, the skanky tourism, but also in general, right? Women going to a beach someplace, and a guy meets a guy on the beach and sort of pays for a couple dinners and that is also a kind of sex tourism that we don't necessarily think about as an industry, but nonetheless the same relationships are being played out.
And sometimes though, it's more about like, well, I'm going to have, I'm going to find a boyfriend there for the temporary. I have this on my desk because I showed in my class. I shouldn't really promote some other thing, but this film is really great. Cowboys in Paradise. It's the boys there, in Indonesia with all these European women, and they have their girlfriends, right? And then they keep these ties because these women send back money, and they have multiple girlfriends. And
I mean, I don't know if you or any of the folks who were in the webinar watch 90 Day Fiance, but that is the story of 90 Day Fiance, right? You either have men going from the US and meeting lovely always younger women, of course, or you have women going, and they all have been on the beach and they met this great guy, and now they're going to get married. And often that great guy is much more like the cowboy on the beach in Indonesia, right? So all these dynamics around privilege and I would say privilege and gender and race and class I mean, if we think about it, are very much colonial relationships,
Right.
right? That get played out in tourism.
Well, here's another, because you did mention the first chapter, and that was where I was originally wanting to go, because to me, that and your chapter bring up the biggest contradictions for that I've grappled with in general, like in thinking about these things. So that first chapter talks about the fact that you have a contradiction between being, well, what we would say maybe cultural universalism and cultural relativism, right? What if you
Right.
travel to a place where women are treated as unequal people? What do you do as that, even as that white woman traveler, right? Do you travel alone anyway? Do you not wear a hijab because it's oppressive in your
Wow.
mind? Or do you conform to something that you don't, you believe shouldn't universally shouldn't be the case? Like how do you rectify that as a woman traveler yourself, or as a theorist? I mean, what do you do if you want to be a solo woman traveler in Saudi Arabia? Well, you can't, but it's something like that,
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, those are of course, the questions I asked myself, right? And but I do think, to make it easier, we do know, I mean, many of us women know that when we travel in certain places, we need to dress in other ways. And I mean, even if the students in the study abroad bubble were having difficulty with that notion that they can't wear short shorts in Guatemala, most of us learn, and if you go to the Peace Corps, that's one of the things you learn. Like, you have to dress appropriately, so you have to cover your shoulders, or maybe you have to wear dress. I mean, and okay, maybe you're going to complain about that, but it makes some sense, right? People, you can sort of understand that. So in some ways, we're just extrapolating from that,
Yeah.
right? Respecting local customs, and understanding that local customs, whatever they are, that if you don't respect the local, people get irritated and it's disrespectful, right? I mean, I think about it again, to bring back to my own experience in my hometown of Sedona. When we have people come who act badly, who ride ATVs off the road, or we are unhappy. They're not respecting our local, they're not respecting our customs, and they're not respecting our space. So if I think about it that way, it makes total sense. When I think about it as a liberal feminist, there's a huge contradiction. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I
Because
think
what you're doing is you're replicating maybe not the colonial narrative, but you're replicating the oppressive, gendered narrative by conforming to what they want in that culture. But as anthropologists, of course, you say you got to do what the culture says,
right. And as a respectful person, I mean,
as a
if you go
respectful
to
person.
someone's house and they say to you, we don't wear shoes in the house, you're unless you're a real jerk,
Right.
you're going to take off your shoes, right? I mean, that's sort of the ways that we're supposed to respect other people. And if we don't do that in other places, then it says that our rules are more important than your rules, right? Even though it's your place. And again, even as I say those words as a feminist, I find I have this little tension in my head, which is why I love that chapter so much.
Yeah. I mean, it really is thoughtful. It's a great lead off, chapter.
Right. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we should, we could talk a little bit about the hosting though. And again, I guess the best place to begin is yours also. I mean, Lynn Bolus, who's written a book on this, on women, and, this idea of like the smile, you have to smile even though you don't mean it, or you're not smiling because you're happy, because you're being marginalized and taken advantage of. And if Lynn, I don't know if she's in or not. I know she was going to come. We can have her pop up, but
Also, just to add, I love the notion of this white teeth, right? Because anthropologically, when we think about smiles, we know that like way back, that showing your teeth was a sign of maintaining your boundary. Right. And so, but then it became a gesture of interaction, and then became what we know as smile. So that coupling of the white teeth and the smile is so smart, when we think about how these women who are really so strong and so entrepreneurial have to engage in this tourism economy.
Yeah, absolutely. Now you've worked in development, obviously Save the Children is a tourism development organization, but I mean, you've been in Southern Africa,
Sure.
working in seeing, helping small scale entrepreneurs work in the tourism business, like you talked about the baskets, or
Yeah.
that's another contradiction, isn't it? About not the feminists necessarily, but the colonialism, right? We
Right.
come in and we kind of are dictating how to best engage in a global market network,
Yep.
which is colonial or neo-colonial or impure, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
But yet at the same time, they often want to enter into this, even if it means some sort of marginalization.
Right.
How do
Right.
you rectify that or balance that?
Yeah. So first, I did want to say that I think that development and tourism does get articulated in places where there is tourism. So some of my I worked for Save the Children in Somalia, and of course this was before, of course, Somalia fell apart, but there was not necessary. It was very difficult to get there, so there wasn't an active tourist market.
Right.
But many of the development activities involved women producing something that did end up sort of in a craft store that the expats who were there would shop in. And so in Botswana, there's an active tourism market, there's an active safari market, right? And so their development gets linked very clearly because that's one of the ways you can make money. So that was the link with baskets. Yes. No, absolutely. I mean, in Botswana, the women were happy to do whatever they were told in order to make money. They were happy to sell their baskets. And one of the things that always surprised me, I mean, again, I am the lady in my chapter. I am the lady who is mesmerized by the baskets, right? I am the lady who goes to the museum on this once a year basket exhibition day and just like, oh, do I have enough money to buy this? Oh, that's so beautiful. Oh, look at that color. Yeah. So I see that side. But for the women, the basket weavers, they had this, right? They had this economy where they would do whatever they could. They had a gig economy, essentially. They would brew local beer. They would sell batteries and soap that they bought in the town. They would weave baskets. They would have farming plots. So they would do all sorts of things. And the baskets that were sold to tourists were one of those things. And so if that industry took off, they would make more baskets. So they were super happy about that. But then after a while, even before the industry really came to a close, the women were saying to me, yeah, okay, baskets are good, but they really hurt my back. All this weaving hurts my back. And I would really rather have a little shop. So maybe you could give me a loan for a little shop, because that would be less stressful for me. And so while I thought that making baskets was this artistic endeavor, right? This like close to God endeavor of creativity. They thought it was one more way of supporting their children. And so for me, as a traveler and tourist, when I think about shopping, I do think about how do we support the local economy, right? I think that if people are, I mean, I have a scarf on that I bought this summer in Guatemala. I went to talk to the Mayan weavers there. And of course, I'm going to support their work. Of course, I know how important it is. But I also know that reliance on an external market that is not even internal to your own country can create an unsustainable business business project, right? I mean, for the Mayans who wove this beautiful scarf, they have an internal market. I mean, Mayans wear their own textiles, and then also tourists buy them, and they're sold to tourists. In Botswana, no one locally bought the baskets. When people needed containers, they would go to a store and buy something plastic.
Right.
So they weren't able to build that internal market, which seems so important.
Yeah. Exactly, because what this is for us, it's a craft, right? Which again is also a gendered sort of term that has a lot of baggage. An art is different, but for them, it's like something. Maybe it is an art or something. It's something that's not necessary. We could get it easier and better in the global marketplace. The plastic thing. Although I have to say, we have an exhibition right now in our museum that I run. that's comparing how medicines are made in West Africa versus here in cosmopolitan medicine. And so we have like a chemistry set and everything. And then we have these similar kinds of things like containers. But the containers we got were donated by a relative of a Ghanaian professor here, because she said, look, the museum has to have these because the white man's containers don't have the efficacy, of the medicine. You have to have these traditional kinds of things. So it's kind of an interesting, like, when do you use these traditional, implements?
And also, I mean, in Botswana, it was because the plastic was modern.
Yeah.
And people wanted to signal their own modernity, right? But I think that there is a certain point where you get enough local university professors who start to understand the wonder of culture and the wonder of history, right, and tradition, and understand the importance of it. But that, I think about when does that happen, and what are the variables that need to be in place for folks to start to promote,
like to teach in locally, you mean, to teach? Yeah. Well, that goes really well, because we're almost out of time. Actually, we've been talking for a while. Let's see, who's available? Is can I
Karen, I know.
Karen, do you want to come up? Because I'm gonna Karen, I'm gonna allow you to talk. I'm gonna pull you up here because I would love I'm gonna give it to you now. Yep. So you should be pulling up. Yep. Okay. Because your chapter 2 is is the 3 chapters at the end are really nice case studies for, all right, how do we empower? How do we negotiate? How do we negotiate this?
Which is so important. Karen, so great to see you, and thanks for joining.
Sure. Thanks for having me this morning. It's morning here in California, so.
Oh, great. Thanks for waking up early.
Sure.
So early.
Do you want to say a little bit about your chapter and what you talked about in this case study here?
Sure. So for me, centering women in tourism wasn't this extra hard thing to think about, because the women were always at the center of tourism in the place where I work. So it's a community that first drew tourists as an ecotourism destination. So they were tourists that were fine with rustic accommodations. They didn't need much. They were not looking for luxury. And women in the community were the first. So the first pension was run by a woman. Women took in student travelers who were going there to study botany and biology and tropical species. So women took them in and rented rooms and basically monetized being a mom. They took all of their mom skills and in various ways found ways to translate that to a tourist market. And they did so very much knowing that it was for their own kids. It was because they were moms they were doing it too, right? They wanted different futures to be possible for their daughters in particular. And they really created a world that was an absolute gender revolution. And the community have created a world where kids of all genders had to really shift their roles and stop seeing this as women's work and this as men's work. But there was a blurring of those boundaries, and it was really the women who ushered that in. And they did it very much on their own terms, and they really pushed gender norms from the inside out. Gender norms had been very rigid for a long time. Women couldn't even really leave the home to go visit their mom too much, or people would talk. But they were in this community where they could, for one of 2 women's cooperatives, they could use the existing dairy truck infrastructure to receive supplies and make arts at home, and then send them back on the milk truck to sell in the tourist hub. So they didn't have to leave home technically. And the other cooperative was also equally brilliant within their own cultural constraints to say, well, they wanted to make jam, which they would sell to tourists. And again, this too, there was just a little bit of extra money, but that extra money went to kids' school fees so that kids could stay in school. So it was very much, again, rooted in their being parents and their parent role and their skills as moms. And that one, there was a lot of pushback against being able to do that, because they would all have to leave home like once a week to make jam in a central location. And that was, some of the husbands weren't having it. Some of them were completely supportive from the start. And the last holdout, they had to figure out how to navigate that. And so they built their little building on the corner of that guy's land so that technically his wife and daughter never left home, right? So it was these perfect solutions from within in order to push boundaries in keeping with how local women in communities wanted them pushed to begin with. And then any outsiders. So at the time I was a college student on study abroad, right? It was they used us to kind of back up, shore up what people in the community wanted to begin with, as opposed to this model of outsiders coming in saying, hey, you know what you should do. So it was really this model that just worked beautifully, right? It respected what people in the community wanted. It recognized that people in the community were not all of one mind, and figured out how you could use foreign support, whether through research or through foreign monies and tourist dollars, to support what local women wanted in communities.
Yeah, I when I first read your chapter, I really loved the pieces where you wove the women going to the river, and the notion that space, that the space, that how empowering and how empowered they were, and made those spaces empowering. So I'm having goosebumps just thinking about that.
So work for them was always this place that was both a burden, but also there was some freedom in it. It was one place where everyone could do their own thing. And that piece that I wove in, it started out as something I wrote when that woman died. Like, being far away as anthropologists, we can't attend the rituals always of people who've been extremely important in our lives. So it's like, well, how can I write something about her that really shows her legacy? And then when this chapter came up, I thought, like, oh, I kind of want to blend those in. I want to add in a little bit more humanity to academic writing when possible, and have real people really show their trajectory as whole beings.
Right. So, I mean, I guess your what you said also begs the question, how do we negotiate the neo-colonial or the privileged tendency, which is we mean well, right, to help foster this kind of thing that happened organically in your area in Costa Rica, in other places around the world. I mean, obviously, we know as anthropologists, there's not one size fits all, and it has to be very contextual. But at the same time, if people are listening, often in the tourism industry, right, they'll throw up their hands and say, look at these anthropologists again, right? They're just saying, look at this case, can't replicate it, we shouldn't do anything about it. How do you see your message getting through if somebody asked you to advise them in some other part of the world? I mean, what can you
Absolutely.
do?
I think we can replicate it in the sense of, and it goes back to this volunteerism thing, like, who's saying what needs to be done? So if we're listening to local communities, like, I have, extra resources or extra time or extra resources in terms of being a researcher, what's useful, and letting communities define that, that's how we replicate it, right? As opposed to these models like, oh, I think if I lived here, I would want this convenience, so I'm going to try to do this. And then things go horribly wrong, right? They're often counter to the interests of local communities. And we see that especially in the volunteer tourism industry, right? It's not just that it's not helpful, but that's potentially damaging, and tourists leave without ever realizing that, without ever knowing it. Certainly not meaning to do it, but also not knowing it. So if we are, as researchers or as tourists, are figuring out, like, okay, what is a locally run organization, or if it's a volunteer agency, like, in what ways are they partnering with local communities, and how are local communities had better have a majority say in what's needed and how that need gets met, then that's how we replicate those situations that can work, that really can use tourism in positive ways as opposed to neutral or negative ways.
Yeah. I always add too, this idea that, anthropologists, we do slow research, right? Like, you have to really understand that context before you can even try to provide the space, for the people to do that. And so often you have in NGOs, you have that rapid, what was it, RRA, it used to be called rapid rural appraisal. You'd swoop in for a week. Let's talk to the key stakeholders. Even if they are women, they're probably the privileged women in the community, sometimes. And so it's like, it's hard to, what can you learn in a week,
So I want to go back to that study abroad discussion if we can for just a minute, because that's where I think I've really tried to put a lot of effort. It's okay, we can do so, like you, I work at a state university. Most of my students are first generation. Travel is really this thing that people have not done. People do find safety in study abroad because they know, like, okay, they're going with this person that we know, this person who's willing to talk to parents in a couple different languages, and this person has a 30-year history in the communities you're going to visit, right? So it is that short-term study abroad can work really well if you're like, okay, I have already worked for decades to establish trust here and to know what's okay to do, what's not okay to do. That's a great model. But I also find that as short-term faculty-led study abroad programs are on the rise, the third party organizations are like, oh, we can do this. And then it's just becoming tourism again. And it's
Oh,
it's
it's
so
so
hard to
easy.
push back against that. And I think, no, we have this unique thing that can really be effective at teaching our students how to travel responsibly and effectively in what's often their first time traveling, right? And then be able to carry out those practices beyond. And there's so many structures of academia that get in the way, right?
Yeah.
It's just, it's such a battle, but I think there's a real value in doing that. And that is how people can have an anthropologist experience without the slowness, because
You
whoever's
can't.
leading that has already done it, has already put
Right.
that time.
And then of course you have that ethics. I write this the final chapter in my own edited volume in this book series on study abroad and the quest for an anti-tourism experience is this idea of the ethics, because then you have, like you say, 30 years, let's say, working with these people who are either your friends because they become friends, or they're key informants or something, and you have very short-term students coming. I mean, my trips are 6 weeks, 5-6 weeks.
Right.
And then they go, and then you get another batch the next year. If there's an issue between that person and your interlocutor for 30 years, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to be on the student side, which of course you are, but at the same time, you have these relationships you don't want to burn bridges with, it's tough.
Yeah, I mean, so I really think through how much time to spend in each community and how.
Mhm.
But I also have is such a short term. It's 3 weeks in Costa Rica because our students really can't get longer than that. That's as much as someone can push for getting time away from work potentially. And we have a couple weeks online in advance, so I can really prepare them for what they're going to see, why it's important to travel in this particular way, et cetera. And that why, rather than volunteer travel or this sort of veneer of service travel, we're going to just make sure that everywhere we're staying is locally owned, everywhere we're eating is locally run, so that people are, we're putting money into local economies that grown adults can decide how to best address their own concerns and their own issues,
Right.
rather than presuming we know what people need.
And it helps to be sustainable, right? Socially sustainable and sort of environmentally sustainable if you discount the carbon footprint to travel. But yeah.
I always say that because I live in Sedona, I always say that, we should be thrilled when we see tourists. We should be really happy that guests are coming into our town and that we're sharing the beauty with them. And it seems like in study abroad, we want the same thing, that people should be happy that folks are coming and we're developing relationships, right? Rather than feeling as though tourism or students who are hanging out behaving badly are actually adding to our troubles, adding to the difficulties that we experience.
Right. I mean, this is, you start the book, Frances, with and Florence Babb also talking about COVID, because it almost seems a little funny, not funny, but like interesting to read now, a year later. But there was this idea of the reset. Are we going to be able to reset? And I guess it doesn't seem to be that way. Maybe things are getting better. What do you think about that? I mean, I guess we should be ending soon, but I do want to pick that up. And if anybody has any questions, please do type it in the chat, because we have a couple minutes left. But in terms of this kind of reconfiguring and repositioning tourism and travel to be decolonized, and do you see any potential, or have we just snapped back the way we were?
I just think there have always been these different ways of doing travel. So it's always been possible to be a fairly responsible traveler. Like you said, there's no way around the carbon footprint, but we need to make sure that, I feel like if students are learning about sustainability in ways that they're going to bring back home, that maybe sort of offsets things a little bit, right? People who wanted to do that are still going to do that. People who have zero interest in doing that are still not going to do that. That part's going to snap back to what it always was. But I do think communities had that pause, in some ways economically devastating for a lot of communities. Say, okay, we do need this, but here's how we need it. Here's how we need to constrain it.
Right. I also think that I don't know that people are behaving better, or tourists are behaving better, but I do know that the state writ broad is starting to put constraints on tourism, right? So and it's because of all kinds of reasons, right? So Venice, as we know, is just now charging an entrance fee to go into the old city, right? I was just in San Diego last week, and San Diego is putting real constraints how close people can go to the sea lions. And so there's an understanding, I think, that it may not come from the bottom up, which is what we had hoped, right? That people who were traveling would start to act in different ways. But at the state level, I think that and I'm again, broad, that we need to think about our resources and what it means to local community and start our policies there.
Mhm.
So maybe that's not what I expected, but I think that could be a more positive way forward.
Sure.
Yeah.
I
always say that tourists will do whatever you tell them to. If there is a blue can in your hotel room that says recycling, there might be some thought about recycling, right? Maybe, but if there's no waste basket, there's no recycling place in your room, then it's very difficult to do anything. And so
Right.
often we need those structures. And again, because tourists often think about themselves as being structureless, as being in this liminal state, right? That kind of structure may be useful in helping us understand how to respect the local. Respect.
Let's hope anyway. Yeah.
Well, we'll see.
Any questions? Any comments? I know people are starting to, it's 11 o'clock, so. Well, anything else you wanted to say about the volume? What are you going to do next? What's the next book?
So I'm working on a book on travel. I was recently, since now I'm on this sort of anti-colonial understanding of tourism, I recently went to the American Caribbean. And I was interested in, I was very interested in tourism in Puerto Rico. I mean, it's just fascinating the way that the colonial history has mapped over. Now the National Park Service, really. What was a colonial fort, now we're all going to look at colonial forts. And so somebody there brought up the notion of how do we travel well? If we're going to think about travel, and we know this, that there is no good way to travel given the carbon footprint, then how do we think about this? And so that's one of my projects. And what do we know about traveling? And how can we, for those folks who want to be deliberate about their practice, how do they think about that? So that's one of the projects I've been working on.
Fascinating. Yeah. So you're going to have to talk to a lot of people.
Read a lot of things. Yes.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. Thanks, Karen, also for popping on here as well. It's a great, really, again, a really wonderful book. It's really thought-provoking too. I mean, really, you want to think about so many different things. It's Recentering Women in Tourism, Anti-Colonial Feminist Studies. It's really great. You could read it together, which I think that you did a good job about, kind of as the director, as the editor, kind of putting these together in a way that really speak to each other. But of course, they could also be read solo chapters as well. Just a really fantastic book. And of course, anything with the Trevi Fountain on the cover is
absolutely
fine by me. Well, thank you, Frances. Thanks so much for joining us. Yeah, thank you so much.
Michael, thank you for all your help and support. I could not be more pleased. And Karen, it's been a pleasure working with you. And I think your chapter is so important because we want to know, well, so now what? What if? And you provide those possibilities.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thanks so much. Thank you.